I thought we could start with the bottom line for me, which is the BC Human Rights Code.
Okay.
And so what we can see in the code, as I've shared with you, is the very first purpose of the
Mm,
BC Human Rights Code is in this language of ours, collegiality, right? The very
mm,
first purpose of the BC Human Rights Code is to foster society in British Columbia in which there are no impediments to full and free participation in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of British Columbia. So it's a very good aspirational goal, but
mm,
what I've seen in your work is that this actually works
mhm.
when it comes to the post-secondary sector. So what are your thoughts about how um, it, what it looks like when it goes right?
Oh, now that's a really big question, so I have to try to unpack it a little bit. Um, what does it look like when it looks right? What does a university environment look like when people feel that their voices are heard and they're included in that? Um, Academia, as always, has been characterized by very vibrant. There's a lot of vibrancy in academia, particularly among faculty. As part of our nature and part of our work is that we burnish our ideas in discussion, debate, dialogue, um, pushing back and forth on each other. But that there are, so that we don't, what we're not trying to do is make everything quiet, but to have it be vibrant and not destructive. So, and how we go about having these conversations with each other, how we raise the concerns we have. The other thing that's very characteristic for me of an academic culture, particularly faculty, is our role in dissent. Again, that's part of the culture that we have about critique, and how we challenge ideas and thoughts. Um, and a lot of folks, particularly administrators, are not particularly comfortable with that. Although for me, it really is part of our culture that we do that. So when an environment is collegial or one of inclusion and belonging, that I still think you have that vibrancy. I still think you have dissent. I think you want dissent, because we know that we're dynamic. It's an ongoing challenge to address and consider not only different voices, but the issues and perspectives that are raised. And we want people to stay engaged. And so that vibrancy helps do that to the extent that it's a more collegial or constructive form of vibrancy. And I think we, honestly, at heart, I think we know, many of us know quite well what it means to have constructive conversation, debate, discussion, exchanges. That can be really quite passionate. So, um, and I'm probably rambling. So I'm
Not at
like,
all. Yeah.
feel free to jump right in there.
um, so so let's continue to set out some baselines here. Like that there's a lot there,
Hmm.
and you made me think of my very favorite ethics prof at U of T, um, who said, even a dog knows the difference between being kicked and being tripped over,
Right.
right? And he says this as a fellow dog lover.
Yeah.
And but it is possible then, clearly, to have a vibrant um, collegial
Yeah.
dissent and critique without
Oh,
it
yeah.
resulting in bullying and harassment.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't, my sense about bullying and harassment is they are never about um, creating connection, um, enhancing our thinking and the way we go about, thinking about the world in different perspectives. They are, from my point of view, and I think the research certainly backs this up, is they're about asserting dominance, about the idea of primacy of narrative and primacy of perspective. And so when I've seen, and probably anybody listening to this, and you, Michael, whenever I've seen debate, exchange, whatever other words we want to use for how we engage, when I've seen them go bad is when they are subverted in surface in service of silencing and asserting dominance of what is the right way to think, the right, yeah, just the right way to think, the right way to approach things, the idea about one way. I'm always, my ears are always very alert to statements like, this is, I have no choice. This is how it's supposed to be. This is the way it is, that kind of thing. And I think particularly in an academic environment, we need to be able to explore all of that different kinds of variety. And one of my colleagues reminded me about when Einstein first really came on the scene and expressing his thoughts, which were very different than the dominant narrative at that time. There was actually a book published by over 100 scholars dismissing and undermining and whatever. So, and it was a book. Now, on some level, I don't have a problem with that kind of dissent, but the development of a coalition almost to take on that dissent and go after him on that is one that I find somewhat troubling. So I think things like dissent, like debate, like critique can be subverted, and people can wrap themselves in it to suggest that what they are doing is completely consistent with the norms that we have as an academic environment, that it's completely consistent with vibrant debate, with the words just escaped me, but the vibrancy about about academic freedom, right? Which is, and we can have lots of debate and discussion about what academic freedom is. And I actually think that's something we should be talking a lot about. We should, if someone says to me, well, you can't tell me that, or you can't say I can't say those things because that's academic freedom. And I think that opens up an opportunity for conversation to be able to say, okay, tell me what academic freedom means to you. And I mean, if I'm really engaging in discussion, dialogue, debate, all of that type of thing, I'm really curious about that. And I want to know, because I think our ideas about things are clearly shaped by the basic set of assumptions that we have. And if I really believe that academic freedom essentially can be translated to mean I can do what I want, when I want, however I want, as long as it's got some connection to my scholarship or my creative activity, then, that can certainly influence how I choose to go about doing it. And I think it's really very consistent with an academic culture for us to ask each other about those assumptions. So what do you mean when you say academic freedom? That falls within academic freedom. And let's have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about academic freedom, and are there limits to it, and what do they look like? And then within that, hopefully that context, then we can talk about, so given what just happened here, how does that fit? So, I mean, I think strengths that faculty bring in these situations as a reflection many times of the training that they've had is critical thinking, is the willingness or the ability, maybe there's not a willingness sometimes, but the ability to be curious and suspend judgment and conclusions before you have a sense about what is known and what is available. But then also asking those wonderful questions about what is it. One of my favorite sort of diagrams or way of thinking about things is the old Johari window, right? Where we talk about the things that we know and the things that we have to discover. And you get 4 panes when you do that, 4 panes of the window. And the first one is, this is what we know and how we know it. Another one is, this is what I think I know, and this is what I need to do to affirm that or check that. Then there's the section of the window that says, here's what I know I don't know. And then my all-time favorite one is the what I don't know that I don't know, right? And that I remember when Rumsfeld said that way back in the 90s. where he said that and the media ridiculed him. And I said, yeah, because there's a lot we don't know that we have no idea that we don't know. And in particular, if there are only a handful of voices that are allowed to stipulate what we know and what we don't know, I mean, if you really come from a dominant narrative, then you do believe that, there's not, I know what we don't know, but if you really come from more of a mosaic or a multicultural or a multiple perspective idea, then you have to believe that there are things that you don't know. And then that suggests that you need to stay open to the possibilities of what goes on. And I think bullying and harassment is not a mechanism for curiosity, for vibrant academic discussion, I deeply worry that it disrupts fundamentally knowledge development, knowledge utilization, and it is not about critical thinking. It is not.
So that really does stir up the nerd in me, because there's a very, to use nerd language, there's a very steep epistemological price we pay when it comes to this, which is to really, instead of doing the work we're supposed to do as in our sector, we end up entrenching forms of bigotry, ignorance. We shut down critical thinking. We shut down the possibility of any kind of, when we need it most, progressive imagination, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the pandemic did something really interesting. It did a lot of things, but it did something really interesting in that, for example, when I think of my own institution, here's an example where for years we've been encouraged to do more online teaching pedagogy. And some faculty engaged that, but a large majority of them did not. And then we were forced into a situation of having to do it. Now, not under ideal circumstances, pivoting in the middle of a semester. In our own college, by far the majority of our faculty had never done anything like this before. So they had that pressure on themselves in terms of how they saw themselves as teachers and being in this situation where it was so unfamiliar to them. But we also learned some interesting things, which was that we actually could do some decent pedagogy, some decent courses in online. We also got clear about the ones that we really felt, no, this is not, or that kind of online education we're working with was not fully. So people were challenged in their fundamental assumptions about it. And several, I would say a large proportion of our faculty came through that with their eyes opened up, not only to their own capacities to be able to learn things, but also just that some of their assumptions and fears, those dissolved when we actually were put into the situation where we had to do this. So those kinds of situations, to me, and I want us to remember it, is when we think this is the way it has to be, that there is a way things happen where the has to be gets denied. And you have to go, okay, so now what do we do? Now, how do we, and that's where our critical thinking comes in, that's where innovation comes in, that's where our creativity, the things that I saw faculty do were absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. And on some level, I shouldn't have been surprised, because that's what their capacity is about engaging, about being critical, about being creative, about being innovative, about trying to come up with new ways. And just like anybody else, we get trapped, though. We get trapped in ways of doing things and ways of thinking about things, and then that becomes invisible to some of us. And then it's only when we're faced with something very different to our experience, very new to our experience, and one where we don't have a choice, right? Because, for example, people self-select into environments, right? Whenever they can. Some folks don't have a choice. Pandemic revealed again that there's a variety of choice and privilege involved, but by far the majority of us had no choice but to be in the middle of this and to have to deal with it. in some way or fashion, right? So on the one hand, a colleague and I were concerned that this would lead to more bullying during this time. Again, creativity in terms of now the modes you can use to do this, right? Like cyberbullying and other kinds of things. But we've also seen evidence that there's been a greater understanding about the importance of connection to our colleagues, to our students, to our institution, and how that helps facilitate us getting through something. So a crisis has happened, and at least in that really intense moment of crisis, connection is often a very strong experience that happens, and people learn from that. Now, as we get used to a crisis, we are at risk of losing sight of that and of what we figured out about that. So, how does that all tie back to bullying? I think bullying is about disrupting connection. It's about assumptions about there are right ways and better ways to do things, and yeah, there are right ways and better ways to do things, and that some voices should never be heard now.
Some voices should never,
Yeah.
some voices should never be heard. There's so much to work with there, and it does come back to where we started, which is with the exhortation to create a province, really, and in our case, a university where people truly feel free fully to participate, and this kind of generative space of knowing one belongs, I think, is essential for the kind of adaptivity and creativity that you're talking about, which, as you've found in your own research, we can't take for granted.
No, we can't.
So maybe we can just kind of focus a little bit in terms of your own analysis and definition of mobbing as a form of academic of bullying, academic mobbing, and the I guess the and I've certainly seen this in my own human rights investigative work. Of course, there are examples there were examples in my caseload of people saying horrendously racist things to people on a shop floor. But when we, for example, investigated systemic racism in Ontario's healthcare sector, not a single racist epithet was ever used. It was all very Canadian in that way, in the sense of being very polite. So when you look at in your research of academic mobbing, does the model predict offensive language and threats, or is it something that's more subtle? Like, how have you identified the phenomenon?
Yeah. Well, the word bullying is typically associated with having a single person doing this. The mobbing is when there is a group or a number of people who participate in it. And bullying that persists for a long time in the presence of others can often move into a mobbing situation because the dynamic sucks people in and people feel they have to choose sides. So that, I think that's an important distinction. In terms of the overtness of it, what we've been able to document, and it's not just me, a number of colleagues across a variety of work contexts, is often this starts out very subtly. And it's the subtle remark, or ignoring is a big one. Ignoring and excluding are big. And ignoring and excluding have often been very challenging for people to figure out because they don't know, is that just an oversight? Is it, so part of what's characteristic of bullying and mobbing is that there's a progression to it. So it starts out often very subtle. So there wouldn't be epithets. There wouldn't be things that are really obvious to other people. And I would think academics actually are pretty good at this because many of them understand the visibility and the power of certain words. They understand the structures that are available to them. And so then they could choose their words very carefully and then just be able, when someone confronts, be able to put their hands up and say, it was just a passionate debate, or no, that person had that wrong. I never said that. Or so, some of the popular concepts around gaslighting, right?
It
showing
was
up.
a misunderstanding. It was,
Yeah, there was a misunderstanding. And it's in the patterning that people start to figure out what's going on. So it's looking at it over time and seeing how those things just don't occur in isolation, but they seem to be co-occurring, and they seem to have taken on a progressive tone to them. That, one of the things that Charlotte Rayner, who's written from the UK, has written a lot about workplace bullying, is that it's in the what she calls the not yet bullied stage, which is the early stages where things are starting to happen, that we have the greatest opportunity to prevent or to derail with minimal, because there's right at that point there might have been some abrasiveness, some worry, some concern, but it hasn't taken the form of psychological damage yet, or hurt or harm. And so we can leverage at that point. So having people talk to other people about what their experience was. And in the environment you were talking about, that the BC Human Rights Codes has a purpose about, in an environment where people feel that there is trust and that they can raise things and other people will receive it in an open way without judgment, but with saying, okay, let's think about that. Let's talk about that. Then that becomes a possibility. But as this stuff escalates and progresses, so it's not addressed, then what happens is the person on the receiving end of it also starts to doubt themselves, because these things essentially work to undermine or disable a person's abilities to defend themselves and to cope. And then as you have other people join in, because the dynamics are such that it sucks people in, it's like a spiral. One of the really painful parts is seeing units where now you have everybody behaving badly. And then that also kicks in for individuals. They have to be able to justify for themselves how they, as a decent, moral, ethical human being, could engage in these kinds of behaviors. And that's a tremendous psychological load on people. How can you tell I'm a psychologist by background? But I think that's very true. I think it's very true. And so sometimes I've been asked into situations or asked about specific ones, and really, when you're at that point, it's the best you can do is damage control and recognize that the damage has been done. The ability to remediate is incredibly tough because it's traumatic, and so that then reduces our options for what we can do in situations like that. So that's why I really push the idea, and I'm not the only one, about prevention, about grabbing stuff early on, and I think that's what the BC Human Rights Code, for me, and the purpose is talking about, is what is the environment a place where people do feel that they can raise their thoughts, they can raise their concerns, and know that it will be held in a place and a space for conversation. So there won't be immediate judgment and there won't be pushback until there's an opportunity to explore it, right? The kind of environment that BC Human Rights Code is talking about is one that is completely antithetical to bullying and harassment.
right.
That would just have absolutely no place in it. Now, the other thing I want to make sure I say is when we talk about a culture and a climate in an institution, a lot of focus is often on the leadership of the institution. And I think that makes sense. What I also think we need to think about is what the rest of us do. And from my point of view, there's more of us than there are leaders in an institution, right? And how we react to things, how we engage with it, can influence the culture and the climate that we have. So, I mean, it breaks my heart when I hear people say there's nothing I can do. Like when people witness this stuff and they're in deep pain because they feel they didn't do something. And they said, I just didn't know what to do, or nothing I could do could change things. I mean, what's totally cool is that there are small things that we do that at least can create an opening, like breaking an interaction. You're getting yelled at in the hallway by somebody you're talked to in a very demeaning tone repeatedly, and I can buy in the hallway. I have a great option there. I could go in and confront, and probably one of the things that a lot of people feel more comfortable with is using distraction. Like, okay, I don't like what's happening here. I'm looking at so-and-so's face, and this is obviously not a good place for them to be. I got to break that. Well, what's one of the ways we can break it? By distracting. So coming up and saying, hey, did you forget about that meeting, Michael? Let's go, right? So I can break that piece of it. So part of what I like to help people think about are the ways that they, in their reactions, in what they do, they are communicating how we are to be in this place, right? And I think that's particularly critical for faculty to do, because as workers, to me, they're an interesting category of workers in an institution, because they're a self-regulating profession. Academic freedom is premised on that idea, which means we're to take care of our stuff, faculty stuff. And then we have a culture of peer review. You and I could have a conversation about just who gets considered a peer and who doesn't, but culture of peer review. So all of that says that we should be engaging with each other around each other's behavior, around each other's conduct. From my point of view, we have complete legitimacy to do that. We have the peer review framework. We do this with grants. We do it with manuscripts. We do it in promotion and tenure. We do it in all of that other type of stuff. So we have that kind of permission to do it. And also, as a self-regulating profession, we need to be the ones that do it, because do you really want somebody coming from outside who really doesn't understand what academic freedom is, why we have wider and differential behavioral latitude on things, like why I could say I could critique my dean's ideas, or I could critique my department chairs, or I could critique my presidents. I'm not saying those people would be happy with me, but I can critique those, and there are ways that I can do that are going to encourage the opportunity that they'll stay more open to hearing me say that. Like not saying you're ridiculous and you're stupid. Probably not the best way I'm going to get it. But if I say, when I hear you talk about that, I see this and I wonder about that. Faculty and shared governance, when it's working, and I do understand it isn't always working because it's not always supporting the institution, gives me the legitimate platform to be able to do that. So I can do those things, and we can do that with each other. And before we started having this part of our conversation, you raised the idea about collegiality. And that in some discussion, I found that the most fascinating thing as I've entered into thinking about this is how different faculty think about what collegiality means. And I'm channeling Vic Catano. I miss Vic. Canadian Association of University Teachers, an amazing thinker. And one of the things that Vic talked about was collegiality gets interpreted as congeniality, right? About getting along. And that's, to me, not what it is. Collegiality is about shared power. It's about, working together to achieve things. But somehow it gets interpreted, sometimes collegiality has also been interpreted as an interesting version of autonomy, which is that it's not collegial for me to critique you, Michael, about your behavior. That's not collegial. And I'm like, that actually doesn't have to do with collegiality. And in fact, if you are talking about shared governance, then or shared power, then you do want to be talking about how are the ways that we collaborate, cooperate, and connect. All right. And so I think in order to be a truly collegial environment, that we need to be able to have these conversations. We need to be able to talk about this stuff. And the fact of the matter is, bullying and harassment in academia, oh my goodness. I can give you stats about how frequently it happens. What's more powerful is just how much interest I've seen develop in that area over the last 10 to 15 years. It's not to say it wasn't talked about before. Individual cases, people talking about their experiences, that type of thing. But I sense there's a real shift now. And and faculty and others are coming to understand that this is not inherent in academic culture. Bullying and harassment is not required for academic culture. Now, as soon as I said inherent, I could hear the voices of some of my other colleagues, particularly marginalized colleagues, who would say, but it is built in morally. And they're right, it is built in, but it's not, when I say inherent, it is not fundamental to an academic culture to be that way, right? We have worked it that way. Some of us have worked it that way, and we're comfortable that way, and we want to be able to do that. So I think it is really incumbent on us as faculty to engage really directly in this with each other. And we know how to, and many of us know how to do it already. And some of us just need to feel a little more confident about how to do it, how to engage with people. The other part is we're talking at the level of structure, we're talking at the level of culture. There are individuals who manifest this, and we also need to be reflective of who we are in this space and why it bothers me so much. Michael said this stuff, and why I feel like I want to defend and say, no, we're not like that as an institution. We've never been like that as an institution. This is your problem, Michael. I have to think about why I want to say those kinds of things, not just at a personal level, but also in terms of how that connects me to the structure that we have. What is it that I feel threatened by? What is it that, what does I feel threatened by? What do I think I'm going to lose if I do hear this, and if I do sit with it, and if I do talk about it?
Yeah. Can you explore a little bit more, because you did talk about marginalized members of our communities, of our faculties, and that's certainly what I'm seeing as well in terms of how to use like human rights language. There's a disparate impact, it seems to me, of mobbing on racialized faculty. That in fact mobbing is a part of racialization. So how has that analysis landed in terms of your own work, and it's the impact of bullying on racialized faculty members, Black faculty members?
What to me is really clear from the research is that people are differentially vulnerable to being bullied. And in fact, one author, his last name is Masawa, essentially said that bullying in academia and in other contexts is actually positional. It is inherently positional. And within academia, there's lots of bases for that position. So we have this whole thing around academic rank. We have a whole thing around the power that comes from having the kind of work that you do fit with the current funding agency, priorities, the university's priorities. If you're a great big grant getter or you're a high publisher, that brings strength and notoriety to the institution. And so you're given a certain amount of idiosyncrasy credits for being that way. So there's, but at its fundamental bit, and I think this is where where academia is so interesting, is that in a lot of the workplace bullying research, when they talk about positional, they'll often talk about organizational position. More and more is talking more about social position, social status position, social status inequities. And of course, the diversity, equity, and inclusion literature has talked about that for decades. So that's one of my calls for this, is that, and some of my other colleagues have been calling about this for a long time, is that we need to be connecting in and drawing on and building with those literatures on how we go about doing those things, and how we think about that. like we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's a lot of thought that's already gone into this, and a lot of that happens. But in academia, even tenure and senior organizational position will not protect people whose social identities are perceived as marginalized. It doesn't protect them. So, for example, in the States, African American women, Black women faculty, they could be, they're full professors, they're deans, they're presidents, they're provosts, and it doesn't protect them. It doesn't protect women. It doesn't protect Indigenous faculty. It doesn't protect our colleagues who are LGBTQ. It doesn't. So yes, tenure and yes, organizational position have an influence, but really at its base, the vulnerability is sociostructural. Those are the folks who are more likely to be targeted, and their very existence in universities is a challenge to the structure of academia and a challenge to the institution. Their very existence. And folks, to the extent that they are not conscious or aware of how the social structural inequities fuel so much of what we do and underlie so much of what we do, they will replicate this, right? This is not a surprise to anybody who's probably listening to this. So for me, when we do work in workplace bullying, we cannot do it without recognizing and without always assessing in our measurement and everything else who folks are in the broader social structural system and how and the statuses that are associated with that. And that's for me where bullying and harassment really come together. So that's where human rights actually, that's where it is. So yeah.
Thank you for that. So we're at time now,
Okay.
and of course we could just talk all day.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna put like one
Okay.
really unfair final question to you.
Okay, I'm ready. I'll do my best.
And just call me out and say, no, that's just too unfair, and I'm not gonna answer it. One core thing that we could do to get it right. What's the one piece of pragmatic advice that you might offer to us to just kind of say, okay, here is how you can take a step forward to build truly collegial governance? What would that be? Totally unfair question.
Just one thing.
Yeah. Or the first thing. Yeah.
To be to allow, to recognize, to utilize, maybe that's what I want, our skills in critical thinking, in recognizing dominance and submissiveness, dominance dynamics, our skill in discourse, and to use that to study ourselves, to look at ourselves in that way. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about faculty taking the lead on this. I'm talking about faculty really engaging in the conversations about how voices get heard, how ideas get shared. Are we living up to the values that we say academia is about? Are we living up to academic freedom? Are we living up to free expression? Are we living up to critical thinking? Are we living up to and manifesting collegiality as the notion of shared power? Are we living up to that? And I think faculty, we should be the mirrors for each other. And as channel Al Sharpton, the Reverend Al Sharpton on this, I'm going to paraphrase it quite mightily. We're mirrors, and mirrors are good for reflection, but also for correction, right? And I think if we as faculty do not take this on, and I don't want people to be distracted by, well, I don't know if the word distracted or what. Yes, we have issues with administrators. Yes, we have issues with structure. We also, though, have a lot of issues with each other, you know, and we need to work. That's a very powerful place we need to work and to utilize our influence is with each other and holding each other and ourselves accountable for collegiality, for governance, for academic freedom, and to make sure that gets reflected in our interactions with each other, in our challenges with each other, and in our sense of responsibility and accountability for each other and to each other. How's that?
Wow. Wow.
There's a
Wow.
pack there too.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
My dear friend, Professor Loraleigh Keashly, for that. I'm so grateful that you were able to join us for our conversation.
I mean, if we have to model this stuff every day, we have to get up every day and recommit ourselves to this all the time, recognizing there are times when I have to recognize there are times when someone's going to say, you're full of it. It's just not, or that's naive, Loraleigh. That's so naive. And then I can go using my best academic and say, tell me what it is about that. When you say it's naive, what is it that I'm doing or not doing? And then let's kind of get into that.